People like to say a food disappears because it wasn't good enough, but sometimes it vanishes for a reason as plain as a stained shirt. I can still see them in my mind, the way you see a place you haven't visited in decades, but you could walk there in the dark. A fence line behind a Midwestern garage, a corner of yard that never got mowed quite the same as the rest, a tangle that looked like it had gotten away from the family on purpose. And in that tangle, in the soft heat of July, the black raspberries would come in. Not berries the way the store says it now. Not in plastic, not washed, not counted. They came in the way summer comes in, sudden and generous, a little wild, and gone before you knew you were supposed to appreciate it. There was no ceremony around them. No one held a meeting and decided black raspberries were important. They were just there, year after year, like the porch swing or the clothesline. The canes leaned and arched and reached across themselves, bristling like they had opinions. They made their own shade. They made their own rules. And when they were ready, you didn't have to be told. You could smell it before you saw it, something dark and sweet like jam in the air. You'd come back from the creek or the ball field, or you'd be sent out for something small. Go see if your father's home. And you'd take the long way on purpose. The berries weren't red like the ones you see piled up now in winter. They weren't bright or perky or clean looking. They were deep, almost black, but not quite. More a purple so dark it felt like it belonged to evening. They had that dull bloom on them like a soft dusting, the way plums do. You touched one and it came off with a gentle tug as if it wanted to leave. And if it didn't want to leave, you didn't argue. If you did, it would punish you for it. Crushed pulp in your fingers, juice slick on your skin, a stain that sank in like a secret. That was part of the bargain back then. You got the taste, but you also got the evidence. In the 1930s and 40s, and even into the 50s, most folks I knew didn't think twice about evidence. Summer was full of it. Tomato seeds on a cutting board, peach skins in a tin pan, corn silk in the kitchen sink, dirt under nails. The world had a way of leaving itself on you, and people had a tolerance for that that's hard to explain now. Black raspberries left themselves on you more than most. You couldn't eat them without becoming marked. If you were a child, that marking felt like freedom. It felt like being let loose from the careful rules of the parlor and the church pew. You'd stand out there by the canes with your hands already sticky, your mouth already darkened. Your fingers would turn that unmistakable color, purple that looked almost bruised. It would creep into the little cracks by your nails and stay there all day, no matter how hard you scrubbed. And that color meant something. It meant you'd found the good part of the day. It meant you'd had a moment that belonged to you. But it also meant if you went inside too fast, you'd leave a trail. A thumbprint on the screen door. A smear on the porch rail. A spot on the white enamel of the kitchen chair. It wasn't vandalism. It was just what black raspberries did. I remember women standing at the sink with cold water running, rubbing at a dish towel with soap, shaking their heads the way people do when they're not exactly angry, but they're tired. "Lord," they'd say, not really to anyone, "look at this mess." And yet, most of the time, the mess was tolerated, because the taste was so brief and so good, and because the mess belonged to the season, the way thunder belonged to August. There were other berries too, wild strawberries in June, tiny and warm from the sun. Red raspberries in some yards, if a family had planted them. gooseberries, currants, sometimes. But black raspberries had a particular way about them. They were not polite fruit. They grew where they pleased, along the edge of the alley, beside an old shed, behind the lilacs, near the railroad embankment. They showed up in places you didn't plan for and then acted like they'd been invited. And when their short window arrived, they demanded attention. You couldn't put them off until the weekend. You couldn't say, "We'll get to those later." If you did, the birds would, or the heat would, or the fruit would soften and collapse into itself, the way a good thing sometimes does when nobody meets it halfway. So people met it halfway. Kids picked into coffee cans and old tins. Mothers picked with aprons tied up like baskets. Fathers who didn't fuss over much would come in with a handful and a look that said, without saying, that they'd stumbled onto something fine. In the Northeast, in little towns where yards were smaller and fences closer, you'd see them along stone walls and behind garages. In the Midwest, where the lots could be wide and the edges less watched, you'd find whole stretches of bramble that belonged to nobody in particular, except somehow to every kid who knew where to look. You learned those places the way you learned shortcuts, quietly and with a kind of loyalty. And then there was the kitchen. Black raspberries didn't just get eaten right there by the canes. They went inside. They went into bowls and pots and jars. They got stirred with sugar until they turned into something that looked almost like ink. They got cooked down into jam so dark it could make you pause, because it didn't look like any store jam you'd ever seen. If you spread it on toast, it shone. It had depth. It had a tartness that woke you up and a sweetness that didn't feel manufactured. It tasted like July. Not like berry flavor, like July itself. But even in those days, black raspberries made their own demands. They didn't travel well from yard to table. They were soft and hollow, little caps that wanted to collapse. If you picked them too early, they were sour and tight. If you picked them late, they fell apart in your palm. You had to hold them like something delicate, like a moth's wing. And the juice, good heavens, the juice! It didn't sit on the surface the way some stains do. It sank in. It held on. It was the kind of stain that made mothers keep certain clothes for berry picking, and certain towels for berry season, and certain bowls that, over the years, stopped being white no matter how you tried. You can learn a lot about a household by what it's willing to sacrifice. In those years, a family might sacrifice a dish towel to the summer. They might sacrifice a child's shirt. They might accept that the porch steps would have a little ghostly purple on them until the next rain, because there was a feeling that some things were meant to be used up. Nothing about black raspberries asked you to be tidy. They asked you to be present. Then, slowly, so slowly that if you lived through it, you might not have named it at the time, America began to change what it expected from food. Not overnight, not in a way that made headlines, just in small, steady adjustments, the way a house shifts when someone starts fixing it up room by room. In the post-war years, there was a growing admiration for things that looked controlled. Uniform lawns, smooth countertops, neat aisles, fruit that didn't fight back. Some of that came from good reasons. People were busy. Families moved. More women worked outside the home. Time got counted differently. There were fewer long, loose afternoons where a child could come home with purple hands and nobody minded. And there were new promises everywhere. Promises wrapped in cellophane and stacked under bright lights. The future, they said, would be clean. You could feel it in the way kitchens changed. Linoleum floors that could be wiped in a sweep. New detergents that talked about whiteness like it was virtue. appliances that hummed with confidence, magazines that showed smiling women in spotless aprons, holding bowls that never seemed to spill. Even the way people spoke shifted. Mess became something you solved, not something you lived with. Convenience became a kind of compliment. In that new language, black raspberries didn't have much of a defense. Because black raspberries were not convenient. They didn't wait for you. They didn't keep. They didn't stack neatly. They didn't look pretty for long, and the minute you touched them, they left their signature. By the 1960s and into the 70s, more families were buying fruit instead of gathering it. Not all, but more. And the fruit they bought had to survive a journey. It had to sit on a shelf. It had to hold its shape under a clerk's hand, under a shopper's glance, under the slow erosion of time. The fruit that won in that world wasn't always the fruit that tasted the best. It was the fruit that behaved. Strawberries got bigger and brighter and more uniform. Grapes came seedless and clean. Apples shone as if they'd been polished for inspection. Even raspberries, the red ones, were reimagined into something that could be packed and shipped and displayed. Black raspberries didn't cooperate with that plan. They bruised if you looked at them wrong. They leaked. They collapsed. They clung to their stems one minute and fell apart the next. They weren't built for the modern counter. And it wasn't just the stores. It was the homes. As backyards got neater, the brambles became suspicious. People started to see that tangle by the fence not as a gift, but as an eyesore, something that caught on clothes, something that scratched children, something that looked untended. A man who once might have said, "Leave those, they're berry canes," started to say, "We ought to clean that up." A woman who once might have put up with purple fingerprints on the porch rail started to say, "Not on my new paint." Children got told, more often, to wash up before coming inside, to be careful, to keep their shirts clean, to not track things through the house. And again, none of it was cruel. It was ordinary. It made sense in the moment. People had less patience for fruit that demanded a whole afternoon and left behind a trail. So the black raspberries got edged out, the way old habits do. Not with an argument, with a shrug. When you remove a bramble patch, you don't feel like you're removing an institution. You feel like you're clearing a nuisance. You cut it down, you burn the canes, you smooth the ground, you plant grass. And then summer comes and there's no patch anymore, no dark clusters hiding under leaves, no little thorns to warn you you're close. No reason to come in with purple hands. It happens quietly, so quietly that years later you might find yourself in a grocery store staring at a row of tidy plastic clamshells, and you can't quite remember when you stopped seeing black raspberries altogether. You might even assume they were never common. That's the trick of disappearance. It makes you doubt your own memory. But if you grew up where I did, or anywhere in that broad stretch of the Midwest and the Northeast where people still had fence lines and alleys and spare corners, black raspberries weren't rare. They were part of the ordinary summer. They belonged to the same world as lightning bugs and lemonade stands and the sound of screen doors slapping shut. They were a backyard fruit, a child's fruit. And that's another thing about them. They didn't just stain your hands, they marked time. Their season was short. It didn't stretch all year the way the supermarket makes seasons stretch now. You got them for a little while, and then they were gone. That was part of their flavor, too, the knowledge that you couldn't postpone them, that you had to meet them where they were. When a child learns that without anyone making a lesson out of it, something sinks in. A sense that the world has rhythms you don't control, that abundance arrives and leaves, that you pay attention when it does. But a cleaner, more controlled life doesn't have much room for rhythms you don't control. It prefers schedules. It prefers predictability. It prefers fruit that looks the same every time you buy it. Black raspberries refused to be predictable. They ripened unevenly. They hid. They came in waves. They turned a little too fast. They punished impatience and rewarded the slow hand. They were, in their own quiet way, a test of what you were willing to tolerate in exchange for something real. And tolerance, the kind you don't brag about, the kind that just lives in a household, can erode without anyone noticing. I think about the small domestic scenes that used to surround black raspberries. The way an old photograph holds details you didn't realize mattered until later. A child leaning over a fence, shirt already streaked. A mother at the sink rinsing berries in a colander, her hands turning darker with every minute. A kitchen table with the newspaper spread out because someone knew the juice would drip. A pot on the stove, the whole house smelling like sugar and heat and something wild. A jar cooling on a towel, its contents almost black in the evening light. You can't recreate those scenes with a clean fruit in a clean package. Not really. Because the berry wasn't just the berry. It was the way life arranged itself around it. And when the berry went, the arrangement went too. I've heard people talk about modern life like it's a march forward, as if everything new replaces something old because it's better. But that isn't how it felt on the ground. On the ground, it felt like small choices made for understandable reasons, adding up. A new job means less time. Less time means less patience. Less patience means less tolerance for mess. Less tolerance for mess means fewer brambles by the fence. And fewer brambles means fewer black raspberries. There were other pressures too, of course. Disease concerns in commercial fields, shifting markets, the way agriculture reoriented itself toward what could be scaled and shipped. But in the home, the reason was often simpler. They were too messy, too fragile, too difficult to keep presentable. And there's something a little unsettling about that, because it suggests that a thing can be pushed out not because it fails, but because it asks something of us. Black raspberries asked you to accept that summer would leave a mark. They asked you to accept that a good thing might not stay neat. They asked you to accept that pleasure sometimes comes with a little disorder. And for a long time, families did accept that. They accepted purple-stained fingers at the supper table. They accepted the berry shirts. They accepted the porch rail that would never be perfectly clean in July. They accepted that if you wanted that taste, you might have to bend into a prickly patch and come out a little scratched. That acceptance was its own kind of wealth. Not money wealth, life wealth. The wealth of being unafraid of your own yard, unafraid of a little sticky sweetness, unafraid of a child who looked like they'd been living. Somewhere along the way, we traded a portion of that wealth for something else. For easier cleanup, for smoother surfaces, for fruit that behaves itself. Again, I don't say that with anger. A lot of those changes came with relief. People had hard lives. Convenience can be a mercy. Order can feel like safety. But it did change what we kept. It changed what we considered worth the trouble. And black raspberries, those dark, fleeting little caps of summer, didn't fit into the new idea of worth. I sometimes wonder how many other things slipped away the same way. Not because anyone disliked them, not because they were inferior, but because they were untidy, because they required a certain looseness in a household. because they asked you to live with the fact that joy, now and then, makes a mess. If you've ever seen a child with purple hands and a dark smile, you know what I mean. There's a look they get, half proud, half guilty, like they've gotten away with something. And in a way they have. They've gotten away with a moment that belongs to no schedule. That look used to be common in July. Now it's rarer. And when I think about black raspberries disappearing from ordinary yards, I don't just think about a fruit. I think about that look. I think about the easy permission we once gave ourselves to be stained by the season. Because what disappeared wasn't only a bramble patch by the fence. It was a certain softness toward life. A willingness to let summer be sticky. A willingness to let something good leave a mark. And maybe that's why the loss feels the way it does. Quiet, but persistent. Like a faint purple stain you can't quite scrub out, even years later, if you know where to look.